Good afternoon, everyone. It is presently 4:37 p.m. on Monday, May 25th, 2020. Today we shall be reading Unintended Consequences by John Ross, Part 2E, Growth Continued. We shall be picking up at the start of Chapter 50, Ultimatums, May 27th, 1963, on page 157. So then, without further ado, let us begin. Unintended Consequences, a novel by John Ross, Part 2E, Growth Continued, Chapter 50, Ultimatums, May 27th, 1963. When Amez McKinnon III walked into Raymond Johnson's office at Lambert Burns, he did not immediately notice the items Raymond had placed strategically in various parts of the room. He was chastising himself for almost losing his temper during their last meeting. He was determined not to let it happen again. "Ray, good to see you. Listen, I don't have a lot of time, but I want you to know that Allied is prepared to take care of your man." Raymond noted that Pedro Gutierrez was no longer the Mexican. "They want to make sure that his daughter is set up with long-term care and that his wife gets top-flight medical treatment. To that end, they've authorized me to make a very generous cash offer, contingent, of course, upon the usual terms of confidentiality." Just how generous is this offer? $500,000. I must caution you, though, Amez added quickly, that this offer is as large as it is because Allied wants to put this unfortunate incident behind them and get on with their business. In light of that, the offer is good only until noon tomorrow. Raymond nodded. I can see how Allied Chemical would want to put this, as you call it, unfortunate incident behind them, so they can get on with selling their company to Becker AG. He turned and faced towards the large window that overlooked Manhattan. Tell me, Amez, have you any idea how much each member of the board of directors is going to be putting into his checking account as a result of this Becker deal? It's all cash, remember. No stock swap. I don't know how many shares each board member holds, so no, I don't, he lied. Allison's low man on the totem pole with a little over 18,000 shares. With options, Hatcher's got almost $250,000. The others all fall between those figures. When Becker cuts their check for $49 per share, they are going to be some very happy former directors of Allied Chemical, I can assure you. If Becker cuts the check, of course. McKinnon said nothing, waiting for Raymond to continue. Your $500,000 offer is chump change, and not only because it's tiny in relation to what's at stake here. After legal fees, my client would have less than $350,000. At about 4% after tax yield, that's about $13,000 a year to provide medicine, rehabilitation, and nursing care for a blind, brain-damaged girl who had her 4th birthday last week and a sick woman of 32. I'm not sure that $13,000 would cover the kind of annual costs we're talking about here for 1963 alone, let alone in perpetuity. Miss Gutierrez could easily survive to see her 50th birthday. Given that the daughter's heart and respiratory systems still appear to be in good order, it is entirely possible that she could live well into the next century. In 60 years, I think a $13,000 per year stipend for full-time care will look like an absolute pittance. Raymond picked up one of the 2 cans that were sitting on his credenza and examined it. The can he held in his hand was brand new. The one remaining on the credenza was much older, slightly dented, and its label was faded and peeling off in spots. The label on both cans were sky blue. Mr. Hatcher's $12 million nest egg, on the other hand, will have grown into something truly impressive, barring massive ineptitude on the part of his heirs. Just what are you saying? Raymond set the can down on top of a photo on his desk and faced the other lawyer. What I'm saying is that your offer is neither generous, nor fair, nor acceptable. Given what Allied Chemical knowingly did to a pregnant employee, $500,000 is an absolute insult. Allied is obviously trying to get out of their obligation. I've been doing a little figuring, and $500,000 is less than what the company earns in 2 days. Suddenly the intercom cracked. Mr. Johnson? I'm sorry, but it's a Mr. Morris from the New York Times. He's sitting here and he says he won't leave until he gets a statement on the Allied case. Raymond pressed the button and spoke immediately. Tell him I can see him at 4 o'clock. He can wait there all day if he wants, but if he wants a statement before 4, tell him it's no comment. He says that's fine, Mr. Johnson. He'll be back at 4. Thank you. Amez McKinnon III looked decidedly upset. You can't be talking to the papers on this. We're trying to work with you here. For Christ's sake. If this goes in front of the jury, you know full well you might get nothing at all. Saying the words calmed him, and McKinnon regained his composure. It was not for long, however. Amez, you know full well that I can do anything I want. Just like you can come in here and offer my client pin money for a daughter with brain damage and no eyes. I've been doing my research, and every layer I peel off this onion makes it smell worse to me. He handed the man the quart can that sat on his desk. You recognize that? McKinnon looked at the label. He saw that he was holding a can of weed-killing powder. Herbamax, it was called. As he looked at the fine print on the label, he realized it was manufactured in Germany by Becker AG. Becker's import for the U.S. market, he said, making a statement of fact. Instinctively, McKinnon's eyes went to the second, older can that remained on Raymond's credenza, and he stepped over to inspect it. When he picked it up, he could tell by its weight that it was empty. The label was faded, but appeared to have once been the same shade of blue as the new can of Weed Killer. All printing on the old can was in German, but the layout was very similar. The part of the label where the manufacturer's name would be was worn off, but part of the address remained. It was the same town as the one printed on the new can. Up at the top was the product's name, Zyklon B. Old can of home market weed killer, was it? McKinnon asked. Raymond reflected upon the question. They might have considered it that, I suppose. He handed the lawyer the photograph on his desk. It was a blurred picture of a room filled with a tangle of nude bodies, hundreds of them, intertwined together in the rictus of death. Seemed to work well enough, don't you think? McKinnon set the can down immediately and stared at Raymond. The younger man cut him off before he could speak. Amez, don't waste your time lecturing me about what I can or can't say in court. That's not what you should be worried about right now. I think the Times has gotten a whiff of this. They didn't get it from me, but there are some Jewish secretaries in this office. I can't think of any other particular reason for one of their reporters to try to camp out in our reception area. Raymond could see that his words had visibly shaken the other man. You have until 4 o'clock to come back with a cashier's check in the appropriate amount. If I do not have it by then, Mr. Morris gets his story, Becker gets to look for buying opportunities elsewhere, people who want to buy Allied stock get to purchase it for about $12 less per share, and we get the pleasure of trying to find 12 jurors who have not yet read about the U.S. company who tried to sell out to the German chemical factory that made the compound Hitler used to execute over 6 million people. If, on the other hand, I find you on the other side of that door when I open it at 4 o'clock, and you are holding in your hands a check for the proper amount, then my client gets to take care of his family, Mr. Morris gets to look for other stories, my firm gets to pat me on the back for a job well done, and you get the undying gratitude of the Allied Board and all the other shareholders, whom you will have collectively saved over $50 million in market value by averting the tragedy of having their stock return to its pre-buyout level of 2 months ago. Amez McKinnon III finally found his voice. And what is the correct amount? He had a dismal feeling Raymond was going to laugh at him and demand $10 million. Until 4 o'clock, Allied gets a 30% discount, $7 million. After 4, we're back up to a full 10, or let a jury decide. No counteroffers. I shall relay the message. McKinnon left without another word. 2 minutes later, the receptionist came in, looking very anxious. Was I all right, Mr. Johnson? Did I buzz you at the right time and everything? You did fine, Maggie. Just fine. You can go on back to your desk now. Raymond picked up the empty can from his credenza and looked at it. 2 days before, it had been full of clear lacquer, sitting on the shelf of a hardware store. He stared at the faded label and recalled the odd look the printer had given him until he had explained that a stage manager cannot afford to lose his job just because some fool unwittingly throws away one of the props for the second act of the production. Now we wait for 4 o'clock, Raymond thought as he sat down and let his heart rate slowly return to normal. New chapter here. Chapter 51. An Honest Work Well Rewarded. May 28, 1963. In the 16 hours since Amez McKinnon III had grimly delivered the largest check he had ever held in his hand, word of the huge settlement had spread like a brush fire through the New York legal community. Raymond Johnson did his best to keep a straight face as he sat down at the conference table for the morning meeting. Every person in the office had been staring at him from the moment he had come in to work that morning. Jacob Burns called the meeting to order. It appears that our newest associate has shown his mettle in an area heretofore untapped by this firm. He smiled broadly at the group. Our bottom line is certainly looking better than it ever has, and for that we have Raymond to thank. Ray Johnson kept a neutral expression on his face, but inwardly his stomach was churning. He glanced around the table and saw that everyone was smiling at him. Everyone except Arthur Lambert, who had a thoughtful expression on his face, and appeared about to speak. "That's not quite right, Jake," Lambert said to his partner. "Lambert Burns' bottom line looks exactly the same as it did 2 days ago. That was Raymond's case, not the firm's." "What?" "You heard me, and there'll be no argument about it. Raymond came to me before he took the case to get my approval. I gave that approval, and when he asked what the sharing agreement with the firm would be, I told him it was his case, provided he did not short us any hours. He said he would give up any vacation days if necessary. Raymond kept his end of the bargain, and the firm is going to keep theirs." "But he didn't tell you that the case was going to be worth over $2 million to us." "No, and if he had, I would have laughed at him and given him the same terms. Raymond could not have known himself at that time. I will resign as senior partner of this firm before I will renege on a verbal contract." Arthur Lambert could see that this did not please the other man, but there was no reply. "Oh, don't look so mad, Jake," Lambert continued with a grin. "You still got more money than the new kid." This brought some genuine laughter from the others around the table. "Besides, aren't you always talking about how our reputation is our biggest asset?" Lambert raised his eyebrows. "Think of what it's doing for our reputation, Jake. To have a first-year associate of ours nick the company that rejected us as counsel for $7 million. The settlement was confidential, Raymond started to say. Both senior partners fixed him with a look that told him it was the first stupid statement he had uttered in their presence. Jake Burns spoke, and a smile was starting at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, it'll never make the papers. But you can be damn sure the real players in this town already knew the exact figure before you went to bed last night, Ray. Speaking of confidentiality, it's gonna grate on you keeping your mouth shut every time someone talks about the largest award you have. Which you're gonna have to do. No Guinness Book of World Records listing for you on this one, Ray." "I'll be sobbing all the way to the bank," he said. "Got it all spent already, I suppose?" Raymond laughed. "Not quite, but I do have some plans for a small part of it. I guess this is as good a time as any to bring it up. I'm going to be taking a leave of absence. There's something I've wanted to do all my life, and if I don't do it now, I'm worried that I'll never get around to it. It will require me being gone for about 6 weeks, and the best time for me to leave would be in about a month." He looked at Arthur Lambert. "Since you were so generous before, I'll let you set the terms. If you decide the firm should dock me a year's salary, I'll go along with your decision." "Where on earth could you go for 6 weeks that would be worth a year's salary to you?" Jake Burns asked. Arthur Lambert knew the answer to the partner's question before Raymond replied. Lambert had already decided that Raymond could have his leave of absence. For 6 weeks, or however long it turned out to be, without pay for the time he was away, but with insurance and other benefits. Ray Johnson smiled as his eyes focused off in the distance, and he imagined the butt of his 600 Holland slamming into his right shoulder. "Africa," was all he said. New chapter here. Chapter 52. Preparations for Safari. May 29th, 1963. You got that look in your eye. Tell me you're heading to Africa. If you aren't, then lie to me and say you are. I'm going to Kenya in about 6 weeks, Tony. No lie. 5-week hunt. Hot damn, that's great news. Your boss give you any shit on account of not getting any loot? Tony Kearns asked his friend. Raymond shook his head. I told him it was important to me, and I'd forfeit a whole year's salary if that's what it took. They said no pay while I'm gone, but with benefits in place. You must live all right. Tony Kearns changed the subject. You're gonna get hammered on taxes, I guess. That's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about before I left. I've set things up so that Allied's insurance underwriter pays both the Gutierrez family and me over a 5-year period. That will reduce the chance that they'll run through the money right away and cut my tax bill some also. Both the family and I are going to need some solid direction as to where to put the money. Your advice has been spot on so far. What do you recommend? Tony Kearns took a deep breath. First off, although it's not my specific department, I'm not ashamed to say I'm at least as good as any of our advisors you're apt to come across, and a hell of a lot better than most. Second, for 2 accounts totaling a few $1,000,000, Whitefeld will definitely let me handle them without whining about wasting my time, if you and your client decide you want to work with me. Since it's a lot of money, I was going to put it in treasury bills for the time being. In your own personal case, that's okay if you have a definite plan for investing the money somewhere else in the future. What is likely to happen, though, is that you'll just leave the money there. Treasury bills are about the worst long-term investment you could possibly make. For your client, that goes double. If $4 million sits there in cash, I guarantee you will be burning a hole in the guy's pocket, and in 2 years that money will all be gone. I don't say that because he's a janitor or comes from south of the border, or anything like that. This is your buddy Tony talking, the guy who spends his days watching big companies buy up little ones. Whenever one of the sellers gets a big wad of cash, not stock in the new company, 9 times out of 10 it's gone in 2 years. And these are guys who built successful, thriving enterprises from scratch. If you aren't used to handling serious dough in big chunks all at once, you'll lose it. And you'll lose it faster than you ever dreamed possible. So what do you recommend? For the janitor and his family, get them set up so they get a steady and increasing stream of income for life. But the principal, or at least a big chunk of it, can't be touched. The first idea that comes to mind is a life annuity with an insurance company. For an upfront payment, an insurance company will guarantee monthly payments for life. If you die tomorrow, they win big. If you live to be 100, you come out like a hero. Either way, the customer can't do something stupid and lose all his money while he's alive. For people with health problems, the income stream is very high since payments are based on life expectancy. For you, you've got no dependents and are earning a bunch every year. That's a snap. Stay out of bonds or T-bills and put together a portfolio that will grow. There are equity managers who have maybe 1 down year out of 10, and average about double what bonds pay. Ray, no one ever got rich by lending his money out at 4 or 5%, or buying something that just holds its value. People get rich by being able to create their own wealth. You stick your money in the bank, it grows a little, but you pay taxes on it. Where have you gone? Nowhere. You're marching in place. Say you buy an apartment building or some other hard asset like a piece of real estate. Sure, the rents can go up with inflation, and so can the market value. But again, you're not really getting anywhere. You get more in rent, but everything you buy costs more too. What you'd really like is to somehow be able to put 3, 4, 5 times as many people in the building without having to spend any more money for land or construction, and that's typically not feasible. What are you saying? You, Raymond Johnson, will make more than 10 times the money this year than you ever have in the past. Did you work 10 times the hours? Are there 10 of you now, when there was only 1 a few years ago? Has inflation gone up so that the things people bought in 1961 now cost 10 times as much? Hell no. Your talents and abilities and your marketing of them have improved tenfold. That's all. You have the ability to create and increase your own wealth. That's something that no bond or treasury bill or savings account or apartment building or bar of gold or Rembrandt painting can ever do. Your janitor's family should invest for income because they have to. You don't. You'd still be making a decent living if you'd tried that case and lost. So don't get in the rut of putting your money in the bank and watching it grow more slowly than rising prices. Hell, keep some of it ready for safaris and stuff like that, but put the rest to work in the same way you work, creating increasing wealth without an upper limit. That means ownership of growing companies. Companies that are adding new products to their lines and are the dominant producers in industries that supply products to expanding markets. Companies that have patent protection on essential goods and services. Drug companies come to mind. Or ones that have a hammerlock on some other competitive advantage. Preferably bought at depressed prices because of temporary bad news. He added as an afterthought. Go on. Ideally, Ray, you should of course be diversified. but you should also set things up so you don't have to pay taxes on your earnings before you take them out and spend them just because your money's been growing. Assets get big a lot faster than you'd think when you let them compound without pulling money out every year to pay taxes. Also, the fact that you're getting paid in 5 installments is very good. It will let you invest a fixed dollar amount every quarter. That will automatically force you to buy less when the price is up and more when the price is down. That's the way everyone operates at the department store, but for some crazy reason they abandon this winning strategy when it comes to investing their money. Let me get you the exact numbers, and maybe you can put together a proposal for both the Gutierrez family and for my own account. Sounds good to me, Ray. I may even get a chance to make a few dollars in the bargain. Let me call you tomorrow. Right now I've got to run an errand or two. I've got a little surprise in store for you, Tony. Will do. And let's hit the dump one more time before you ship off to Africa. You got it, Raymond said with a quick nod. He stood and turned to walk away. Kearns didn't know it, but Ray Johnson was heading to a familiar address on Broadway. Morning, Ray. Good morning, Jim. I can't stay long, but I need a rifle. Well, I think you've pretty much seen what's in the rack right now, except we did get a nice sporter built on a small ring Mauser action in the other day. Let me see. Ah, here it is. The man started to walk towards the right end of the rifle rack behind the counter before Raymond stopped him. Sorry, let me clarify. I meant I need one of your custom rifles built up. I can't stay long, but I'd like to pay for it now, if you don't mind. Let me get the order book. If you're in a hurry, maybe you should come back later so we can go over all the specs. It's not for me, Jim. It's for Tony. He helped me out on a big case, and now I'm going to Africa. I want to get him a rifle built up on a Remington Enfield, whatever specifications he wants. I'd like to pay you for it now, though. Well, I can't quote you an exact price if we don't know what he wants done, but... His voice trailed off as he realized that both he and Raymond could probably predict almost precisely what Tony Kearns would want in a rifle. He was impressed that Raymond Johnson wanted to do this for their friend. Let's see now, the old man said, pulling out a pencil and lifting his clipboard. I suspect he'll want an elephant rifle. So that means express sights with a barrel, band, and no scope. Deep belly magazine for 5 or 6 cartridges, depending on the caliber he chooses. No checkering on the bolt handle, standard lapping on the locking lugs, and smoothing the action. Aftermarket trigger. What about wood? Raymond asked. Want to get him something nice looking with some decent figure, but it'll have to be dense and with straight grain through the grip to take up the recoil. Most of our customers want French walnut, but Tony's always said he likes Bastogne for the heavy recoil stuff. Normally it's not as pretty, but I've got a stick in the back that'll knock your eyes out. Be perfect for one of the cannons you guys favor. He wrote some more on the paper. Point pattern on the checkering, Raymond threw in. I figured that, the man said as he continued to make notes. Super-grade swivel studs, front one on a barrel band, one of our pads, probably ought to have a second recoil lug on the barrel, fore-end tip and grip cap out of African blackwood. Looks like about $650, Ray. Let me write you a check, and you can tell Tony the next time he comes in. If there's any other changes, like ordering a reamer for some Wildcat caliber you don't have, or one of your side mounts if he wants a plain rifle instead, go ahead with it and keep track of the extra I owe you. He pulled out his checkbook and a pen. What if he wants a Mag Mauser? The proprietor asked. Raymond put down his pen and stared at him. Right. Stupid question. Enfields, he muttered, shaking his head. Ray finished making out the check. New chapter here. Chapter 53. Familial Bonds. June 8th, 1963. Joe, I don't know what to say about what you've done for us. It's the first time since Harold and I have been married that I haven't been pinched paying the rent and the electric bill in the same month. It was just after 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The former lovers were sitting in the Gaineses' kitchen. Linda's husband had gone to Chicago for the weekend to see a Cubs game. Joe had dropped by for coffee, and the two were talking comfortably. 12-year-old Richard stood on his bed and pushed the lever of the air vent to open it. He had discovered some months before that when it was opened all the way, he could hear conversations held in the kitchen. It was his secret, and he took great pleasure in it, although he had never heard anything more interesting than half-hearted arguing between his parents. Oh, I wish it had been you, Joe, Linda said. What are they talking about? Richard wondered. He remained standing on the bed where he could hear better. Joe Hammond looked at the woman he had realized too late that he loved. Linda Wilson Gaines was 38 years old, but to Joe Hammond she looked only a little different from the night he had first set eyes on her 18 years before. Joe, though handsome in a strong, rugged way, looked every one of his 64 years. Everyone needs a break in life, Linda. Lord, you know how many I've had. It was past time Harold had his turn. They're talking about the license office, Richard realized immediately. That's Dad's whole life now, just about. People create their own luck, Joe. When Hammond made no response, Linda went on. Harold isn't that sort, and he never will be, as I think you know full well. Joe Hammond remained silent. Richard started to feel a little ashamed. He had never heard his mother talk about his father this way. They sat across from each other, sipping coffee and thinking their own private thoughts. Did she leave to go to the bathroom? Richard wondered when he heard no sounds from the vent. I'm worried about Richard, Linda said after a few minutes. That got her son's attention. How so? He does poorly in school. He's no discipline problem, and the other boys like him well enough, so maybe I'm borrowing trouble. But he's slow, Joseph, and he never stays with anything long enough to get it right or do it well. Mom never said anything like that to me, Richard thought as his cheeks flushed pink. These past few years have made me think long and hard about the future the boy will have. You always told me a person needs to plan ahead. She looked at him straight in the eyes. I don't want Richard ending up like his father. Richard wanted to close the vent and leave his room. He knew that's what he should do, and he wanted to do that, desperately. But he was rooted to the spot like a gawker at a bad car wreck. The older man laughed unconvincingly. I don't think a boy's character is permanently set by the time he's 12 years old. Joe Hammond lied. Isn't your concern a little premature? Linda Gaines shrugged, a gesture that said no, it isn't. Any worries about Harold Jr.? Hammond asked, changing the subject. Oh, he's just the opposite, Joe. He's just like you. That's a weird thing to say, Richard thought. Harry has more energy and drive than he knows what to do with. He's not the one who got cheated in the gene pool. What's a gene pool? Richard wondered. I think he may even get a scholarship to Priory, Linda added, naming a local private school known for its academic excellence. Priory? Richard mentally yelled. No fucking way. Even if it's only a partial scholarship, I think we can afford to send him there, now that Harold has the income. That brings up something I wanted to talk to you about, Linda, Hammond said, glad to be on a different subject. Those license offices may be cash cows, but they aren't permanent. Harold may have it for 20 more years, or the governor could get beaten in the next election and his replacement could award it to someone else, and Harold could be in the unemployment line overnight. The governor better not put Dad out of work, Richard thought immediately. Dad needs that job. Linda gave him a tight smile. I've thought a lot about that. We won't be buying a Cadillac or moving to a more expensive neighborhood or anything like that. You've dropped this golden goose in our laps, Joe, and I'm going to see to it that we keep it healthy. I've made sure the staff is competent, and I review all the paperwork myself every day. I've also seen fit to research the governor's prospects, and assuming he isn't found in bed with a young boy, I think he may be with us for some time. In bed with a boy? Gross. Joe, don't think for 1 second that this license office hasn't made a tremendous improvement in our lives. I intend to see to it that those benefits last us for as long as we live. You have lifted a weight from my husband's shoulders, and I will never forget it. She lowered her voice and pressed on. It's been 15 years, Joseph, but I still want you. What? What? Richard wondered, straining to hear. I step on you? Not because I feel obligated, Richard's mother went on. Because I want you in bed with me again. As often or as seldom as you like. It will be our secret. In bed with her? Again? What is Mom talking about? Richard screamed silently. He stood on tiptoe to try to hear more clearly. That would not be a good idea, Linda. But I've often thought... The rest of what he was about to say was cut off by the telephone ringing. Linda answered it, but it was a wrong number. Hammond was very relieved at the interruption and used it to change the subject. He looked back at Linda Gaines. I was just thinking... If Richard doesn't have much ability or motivation, but people like him, then it would seem he's all set for a successful career in the legislature. In a few years he'll be able to give it some serious thought, he added jokingly. His face softened as he looked at the younger woman across the table from him. Let's stay in touch, Linda. I'd like to help you look out for Richard. I'd like that very much. she said in a soft voice that only he could hear. Richard Gaines lay back down on his bed. He wasn't sure what to think about what he had just heard. The last part sounded okay, I guess, he told himself. New chapter here. Chapter 54. Travel and Fire. July 19th, 1963. On the cab ride to the airport, Ray Johnson kept having irrational fears that somehow he wouldn't make his flight. The trip proved uneventful, however, and the cab driver grunted approval at the $1 tip as he handed Raymond his 2 rifle cases. When Ray arrived at the check-in counter, he was sure that there would be something wrong with his ticket. The young woman smiled at him, however, then handed him the claim check for his duffel bag and told him she hoped he had a pleasant vacation. As Ray carried the 2 rifle cases containing his Holland, his Winchester, and ammunition for both towards the international concourse, he was sure that when he got to the gate the aeroplane would have been delayed and would not be there. The big white and red Lockheed Constellation, however, was plainly visible through the glass, sitting out on the tarmac waiting for the announcement that it was time to board. "Hunting trip, sir?" the attendant asked, nodding towards the gun cases. "Yes, something I've been dreaming about for a very long time." "In England? Or is Heathrow just an intermediate stop?" "Just a quick plane change," Raymond explained. "I'm heading for Kenya." The attendant smiled broadly. "Ah, yes. I'll have one of the stewardesses pre-board you, and I'll see that she stows your rifles in the first-class section where the sights won't get bumped." "I'd appreciate that very much," Raymond said sincerely. He suddenly had a flash that he had forgotten his passport, and he clutched his shirt pocket. The document, however, was there. He saw the attendant smiling pleasantly at him. Maybe this safari really is going to happen after all, he thought to himself. Elsewhere, Henry Bowman followed his father outside into the night. He was barefoot as he stepped out onto the front porch in his pajamas, and he moved his tender feet carefully. He was not entirely awake as yet. Henry followed his father's gaze and stared off into the distance. An unfamiliar hue was visible in the sky far away, giving off a dull glow and making a large section of the horizon visible, even though it was the middle of the night. Walter Bowman, who often listened to the radio before going to bed, had heard the news and awakened his son. The Forest Park Highlands was burning. New chapter here. Chapter 55. Safari and Gunsmithing. July 23rd, 1963. Oh my God! Ray Johnson's jaw dropped in awe as he reached the crest of the hill. He was looking at the first elephant outside a zoo he'd ever seen in his life. The animal was immense. Thoughts of the fine impala he had dropped with a heart shot an hour earlier vanished from his mind. Mincer, the transplanted South African, grinned at his client. The young man's ability to spot game and read sign was fully the equal of his own, and this had been a revelation for the professional hunter. Most of his clients were older, typically out of shape, and, as often as not, mediocre rifle shots. Ray Johnson had been a welcome change from that. But here he was acting like every other Nimrod on his first safari at the sight of his first elephant. Mincer gave him a few moments of silent reverie before speaking. "That one's fairly big in the body for this country," he said with a smile. "Tusks aren't much, though, as you can see. I promise we'll find you one that'll make this one look like he's still teething." "How big is he?" Raymond whispered. They were downwind of the bull elephant, and with his poor eyesight he did not spot them, even though they were less than 50 yards away. Past him were 2 other, smaller bulls. About a 40-pounder, I'd say. "We can do better, I promise." "No, I mean the average elephant itself," Ray corrected. Mincer grinned. "Don't get a chance to weigh the whole bloody animal very often," the professional said, dryly. "So I'm a bit rusty on my estimates. Biggest one in the world was taken in Portuguese Angola in 1955. It's a full mount in your Smithsonian, by the way. That one weighed 12 tons, as I recall, which is about double the average for a mature male. Tusks are small in Angola, though, so they put a big set from one of our bulls in the mount. This fella here," he said, nodding towards the beast, "he's a little bigger than normal. Say 7 tons thereabouts." Ray Johnson shook his head in wonder. He was imagining sneaking up to within 15 yards of the huge beast and taking the tricky brain shot. An elephant's brain is about the size of a loaf of bread. An elephant's brain is about the size of a loaf of bread and is surrounded by honeycombed bone. A headshot which misses the brain itself can enrage the animal and cause a lethal charge. Ray was mentally drawing the correct angle of penetration when his guide spoke. "We'd best leave," Mincer said. "There's a chance he might spot us and charge. We don't want to use up one of your elephant tags on a little 40-pounder. Trophy fees for African game were payable in advance and non-refundable. Woe betide the client who shot a charging animal in self-defense without a tag for that particular species." Ray grudgingly followed the professional hunter. Ivory weight was not what was on his mind. He was thinking that hunting North American game would never be the same for him. Elsewhere, "Here it is," Kurt Benke said to Henry and Walter as he handed the barreled action to the boy. They were in the basement of the Benke's home in the German section of St. Louis. It was the most cluttered residence Henry had ever seen, which was not surprising as there were 10 children in the family. The basement shop was very cluttered too. The gun racks and walls were covered with world record groups that Benke had shot with rifles he had built. Some were records that had since been surpassed, and some still stood. Benke had taped or stapled them haphazardly about his work area. He did not much mind when one fell down or got torn. There would always be more. Kurt Benke was a trim man of 47 whose hair was starting to turn gray. He moved quickly, except when he was working at his lathe or mill. Benke was a photo engraver for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper. His machinist skills were entirely self-taught. "Explain to me what you had done, Henry," Walter asked his son. Henry picked up a pencil and turned the custom-barreled Remington receiver over on the workbench. He pointed to where the magazine well had been. Single-shot 40X actions are hard to find, so Kurt machined a piece of 4140's tool steel to fit here in the magazine cut. Then he had it heli-arc welded into position, with something to soak up the heat around the receiver ring so the heat treat wouldn't change around the locking lugs. "Why the metal block?" Walter asked. The work had been done so well that the receiver looked like it had come that way from the factory. "It makes the action stiffer," his son answered. Then he machined the block down so it was the same shape as the rest of the receiver, and made all the threads and everything right instead of sloppy and crooked like they were, and reworked the trigger so it isn't real heavy and full of creep. Benke chuckled. "The factory doesn't do quite that bad a job," he explained. "But I like to true up the threads, make sure the face of the receiver is perfectly square with them, and spot in the locking lugs on the bolt with lapping compound. Then I make sure the bolt face is square with the front of the receiver ring, and the lugs and locking area are perpendicular to the axis of the barrel. Every little bit helps when you're trying to put the bullets all in one hole 100 yards off." "Tell me about the barrel," Walter asked the gunsmith. "It's a Clyde Hart-produced stainless blank. I've always had good results with his barrels. Much as your son shoots, I made him go with the 222 Magnum chamber instead of a Swift or a 222-250, which burn more powder. The 222 mag will last a lot longer. In a 26-inch barrel with the minimum spec chamber I cut, he should still get 3,600 feet per second with match-grade bullets." He handed Walter a loaded round to examine. It was much smaller than the 8mm cartridges Henry shot out of his surplus Mauser. "Left the barrel 850 at the muzzle," he said, speaking of the diameter in thousandths of an inch. "Never seen one left that heavy that wouldn't shoot." Walter Bowman examined the quality of the metalwork. It was flawless. "Looks like you've got your job cut out for you making a stock that will do justice to this, Henry." Kurt Benke smiled at the compliment. "What do we owe you for your work, Kurt?" "I promised Henry that if he saved up for the receiver and made his own stock, I'd pay for the metalwork and scope." Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out his money clip. 55 for the blank and 50 to fit, chamber, crown, and turn it to contour. 20 to machine the block, have it welded in, and grind it to shape. 20 more to true up the action. $5 for the trigger surgery. Scope blocks are free for a first-time customer, though. And I get 15 for a straight-line seating die made with the same reamer that cut the chamber," he added as he reached across the workbench and produced a polished loading tool with 222 mag stamped on it in tiny print. 165 total. Walter Bowman counted off the bills and handed them to Kurt Benke. "Something tells me this won't be the last time I see the two of you here." "No, you're quite right. As soon as we get home, the little capitalist will probably start nagging me to find him more jobs to do to earn money." "You can drop him off here if you want, and I'll put him to work contouring barrels," Benke said with a smile. "Hey, I've got a stock to make first," Henry broke in. The two men laughed, and smiled at the boy. Henry wasn't paying attention. He was staring at the barreled action, imagining in his mind's eye how he would lay out the pattern and inlet the wood to accept the metal. In 10 days, Henry would have a complete rifle. In 6 more, he would have developed accurate loadings for it that would fire to within a half-inch group at 100 yards. Soon after that, he would regularly be killing crows in the cornfield at ranges up to 200 yards and occasionally farther, depending on the wind. By the time school started, Henry would have fired over 2,000 rounds through the single-shot varmint rifle. He would be very glad that he had taken Kurt Benke's advice and not specified a .22 case with more capacity, which would have shortened the barrel's accuracy life considerably. As it turned out, Henry Bowman's .222 Magnum would not need a new barrel for almost 2 years. New chapter here. Chapter 56. Safari to Electric Boogaloo. August 18th, 1963. You ought to be working on my side of the business, my friend, as much as you understand game animals and their habits. The comment startled Raymond. It was a daydream he had found himself indulging in ever since his arrival in Kenya. The 2 men were sitting by the campfire, watching one of the crew tend to an impala steak that was cooking in the plow disc that had been drafted into service as a skillet. It was the end of the 6th day of Raymond's safari, and he had seen more game than he ever dreamed existed. 100-head herds of impala were everywhere. Zebra grazed the plains just like the wild mustangs back in Colorado, except there were a lot more of them here. Buffalo and elephant traveled in herds also. The first time Ray had seen a herd of over 100 elephants, he had not been able to believe his eyes. Most enlightening of all to the Coloradan had been the lions. Every day he had seen a lion take down one of the thin-skinned species and start eating it while it was still alive. The big cat would gorge itself on as much of the kill as possible, then go to sleep nearby and consume the rest of it at his leisure. They lie around like lazy Kaffirs, belching and farting for a couple weeks. Mynheer had said. Then when their fat burns off and they start to get hungry again, they go back to work. Ray Johnson had found the reality of the King of Beasts to be somewhat different from the idealizations of his childhood. What does it take to become a pro? Ray asked the White Hunter. Isn't it hard for someone not from either Africa or England to get the government's okay? Mynheer nodded. Most definitely here in Kenya. Very difficult. Expensive, too, he added. His eyes crinkled into a smile. But for an energetic young bull like yourself, there are other, more attractive opportunities that would be too much for one such as I. Mynheer was 47 years old. Mozambique or Angola are where I would be looking if I were your age. The Portuguese are abysmal at managing things. A Portuguese professional hunter is, what is the word? An oxymoron. Their government might accept a license application from a 25-year-old American? Ray asked. I should think they might pay you to apply, with things being as they are, currently. You see, a pro in those areas is expected not only to run his hunting concession successfully, but also to provide other services to the surrounding community, to act as the local sheriff, you might say. Yes, that's the proper word for it. Mynheer gave Ray a knowing look. Portuguese professional hunters are barely capable of finding their way back to base camp. You can imagine the futility of explaining to them to provide any leadership in the local town, shall we say. He nodded his head. Angola and Mozambique offer almost unlimited opportunity for someone such as yourself. A young man with brains and drive could make quite a bit for himself there, I should imagine. He leaned closer. Would you like me to investigate further for you? May as well while you're here. Pull up stakes and move to Africa, eh? Ray said with a broad smile. That's something I never thought I'd be talking about. He laughed as he imagined cabling Jacob Burns that he would not be returning. Law office would think I'd lost my fucking mind. Raymond leaned back and smiled at the idea. He was unaware of the telex which had been sent from Colorado to Nairobi 2 days earlier. New chapter here. Chapter 57. Telegram from Home. August 21st, 1963. It was after 9 o'clock in the evening when Raymond and Mincer got back to the camp in the Land Rover. In the back was an eland which weighed close to a ton. Raymond had killed it with a single shot at about 175 yards. It was the 14th head of game he had taken on this current safari. Both men were in excellent spirits as the headlights of their vehicle lit up the tents where the skinning crew was camped. "Donza! Donza! Donza!" Mincer called out in Swahili. "Don't let it spoil." The skinners ran to the vehicle as it rolled to a stop. As the white hunter climbed out from behind the wheel, one of the camp crew rushed up to him and handed him a folded sheet of paper. Mincer held it so the setting sun allowed him to read the printing, and his face clouded. "This is for you, Ray," he said as he handed the paper to his client. "It took some time for them to find us out here. I'm sorry." Ray Johnson took the sheet of paper and held it up where he could read it. Exmit, Jipoldep, RCV Trade Corporation, 15th August 1963. Deliver Mynheer Safari's FBO, Johnson of Pitkin County, Colorado, USA. Bad news. Bud and Louise both dead. Single car accident, Red Mountain, last night. Stop. Coroner says heart attack. Stop. Funeral Sunday, August 18th. Stop. This won't reach you in time, so finish hunt. Repeat, finish hunt. Stop. Expect your call from New York City, September 2nd. Stop. We'll handle things here. Stop. Don't get eaten alive. Stop. Uncle Carl. Ray held the telex closer to his face and reread it 3 times before dropping his hands to his side. He stared out at the magnificent Kenya sunset. The news of his parents' death was a violent shock, but he was surprised at how jarring he found the reference to New York City. Ray Johnson realized right then and there that after he settled things in Colorado, he was going to give notice at the law firm and get with Tony Kearns about a long-term investment plan. As soon as that was done, he was going to move to Africa and never look back. New chapter here. Chapter 58. Kennedy Assassination. November 22nd, 1963. Henry Bowman had never seen any of the teachers at Howell School cry before. Plenty of his classmates had cried over the years, especially out on the playground, but this was different. The black woman Henry recognized as working in the school's kitchen was out in the hall, sobbing openly. Henry's 6th grade teacher was blinking back tears and looked as if she was about to lose her composure at any moment. "There's just been an announcement," she said solemnly. "President Kennedy has been shot. The president is dead." There was stunned silence in the classroom for a few moments. Then the 6th graders erupted with simultaneous questions about the killing. "Have they caught anyone? Do they know who shot him? How'd it happen? Are they sure he's dead?" The teacher tried to smile, but the result was a total failure as she attempted to answer the students' shouted questions. Henry Bowman remained silent. His mind was not on the teacher's words, but instead was filled with a number of unrelated thoughts about the slain man. The first was of Max Collins's comments on the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, and his criticism of the young president for the debacle. Henry's second thought was of some photos he had seen of Kennedy on a boat off the coast of Massachusetts, shooting a full-auto variant of the new AR-15 rifle. The weapon had been designed by Eugene Stoner for the Armaments Division of Fairchild Aircraft, and was very light and easy to control. Kennedy had been grinning in the photograph, and at the time Henry had wished that he too could try on the new select-fire rifle that the military was talking about adopting as the standard-issue weapon. As the bell rang and the students ran out the door to recess, the boy's mind switched to another subject. Henry Bowman had substantial knowledge of firearms, and was in regular contact with major importers and distributors. Because of this, his thoughts turned to Joe Kennedy, the dead president's father. New chapter here. Chapter 59. Theorizing. November 24th, 1963. "Quick, honey! They're about to show it again!" Catherine Bowman immediately turned the stove's heat control to a lower setting and hurried into the living room. Her husband, brother, and sister-in-law were sitting on the couch. Erwin Mann sat in an armchair to Sophia Collins's right. Henry sat on the floor in front of his father. All of them stared at the television set, transfixed. The screen showed a crowd inside a room. The people in the scene were straining to see what was about to happen. Then a door opened and some men escorted a young man wearing a dark sweater across the room. His right wrist was handcuffed to the left wrist of one of his captors, a fairly tall man in a light-colored suit, white shirt, dark tie, wearing a sort of dress cowboy hat. Flashbulbs popped and the noise level increased. Suddenly, a short man in a dark suit and light-colored hat with a dark hatband charged into the picture. The film footage being broadcast immediately went into frame-by-frame mode. The short man extended his right arm towards the prisoner. He was holding a revolver in his hand. In the next frame, he had fired the gun and the prisoner's mouth was open in a grimace of pain. By the next frame, the young man had started to crumple to the floor. After he was on the ground, the film speed resumed to normal, and the family watched intently as the police wrestled the shooter to the floor and disarmed him. There was brief news commentary before the station cut to commercial. "Well, that's the goddamnedest thing I ever seen in my life," Max Collins said with wonder. "Pugh!" According to what they've been saying on the news, he did it so that the family would be spared the ordeal of a trial. There was a hint of derision in Walter Bowman's words. Each of the adults in the group murmured comments about the killing they had just seen. "What do you think, Henry?" Walter Bowman asked finally. His son's brows knitted. He was concentrating on forming his answer before he spoke. "That revolver he shot him with. It looked like a Colt detective special with a hammer shroud. That's a pretty rare version. I've only seen pictures of them. Most of the hammer shroud guns you see are the Smith & Wesson Bodyguard." "That's true," Max Collins offered. "The kid's exactly right. Installing a shroud on a Colt is no 5-minute job. The factory sells you the shroud in 2 screws with different thread sizes. You have to buy 2 drill bits and 2 taps to do it. If you're not a gunsmith, you'll ruin a good gun." "What's the purpose of a hammer shroud?" Walter inquired. His son spoke up. "It's so the gun doesn't tie up if you have to fire it while it's in your pocket. The reason some people go to the trouble of putting one on a Colt instead of just buying a Smith with a factory-installed shroud is that the J-frame Smith only holds 5 rounds. The Colt carries 6. Henry furrowed his brows. "Something else I noticed, too. He was pulling the trigger with his middle finger, and laying his index finger alongside the gun. Some people use that technique when they point-shoot a revolver without using the sights." Henry shrugged. "I've tried it, and it doesn't help me any to shoot that way. But there are some people who swear by it." "The kid's eyes are better than mine. I didn't notice that." Max Collins spoke with respect in his voice. "What he's saying is that this Ruby guy is a pro, and from the dead center shot he just made, that fits. Or Ruby happened to walk into a gun shop at just the right time, right after a guy who had the Colt built got tired of it or needed money," Henry added quickly. "And maybe he's got a piece of wire in his index finger from some injury, like that mechanic at the gas station on Delmar, and that's why he was pulling the trigger with his middle finger." He shrugged. "After all, it doesn't take any special skills to hit someone in the chest from 3 feet away." "It sure as hell looked like a pro hit to me," Max Collins said. "That saving the family stuff is a bunch of crap." He changed the subject. "They still saying it was a Mauser that Oswald used to kill Kennedy? I heard that again on a news conference today." "But it was a Carcano they were holding up on television," Henry exclaimed. "And the Carcano's a piece of junk. Dallas cops said they found a Mauser, then an hour later they hold up Dago iron that isn't even safe to fire." "What do you mean?" Walter Bowman asked his brother-in-law. "Shoot a Carcano enough to be able to hit something with it, and it's apt to blow the firing pin back in your eye. Henry'd wear one out in an hour, if it held together. Worst rifle of the war, you ask me. Next thing they'll be telling us is that the gun that killed the president originally came from one of his father's companies." "Why do you say that, Henry?" His mother Catherine broke in. "The big surplus importers like Interarms and Service Armament that I buy from? Joe Kennedy, the president's father, owns some of them. Not those 2, but he owns all or part of a couple of the other surplus gun importing companies." The group sat in silence at the boy's statement. It was something that none of them had known. Finally, Erwin Mann spoke. "Henry, do you have an opinion about the assassination?" Erwin Mann was staring intently at the 6th grader. The boy was startled by the question, but it addressed an issue that Henry had been thinking about all day. "The way the news says it happened seems crazy to me. Someone thinking about shooting the president wouldn't use one of the worst guns ever made, unless he had no idea about what he was doing. If he knew anything at all about rifles, he'd use a target rifle, or at least a good quality surplus gun like an Enfield or a Mauser. Also, anyone who had ever shot a rifle in his life would know that if you had to shoot at a moving target, it's a lot easier if the target is coming right at you or going straight away. Especially if your rifle has a cheap scope on it like Oswald's did, and you're going to fire more than one shot in a short time. You have a real small field of view with a scope, especially those tiny ones with little lenses, and it's really hard to pick up a moving target with one in a hurry." The boy looked at his uncle for confirmation. "The kid's right," Max Collins agreed. "According to all the pictures and drawings they've been showing about the assassination, Oswald had all the time in the world to shoot the president in the chest as the car was coming directly towards him. Kennedy was standing up and not even the windshield was in the way. Now instead, Oswald waited until the car turned the corner and was angling away from him. And after it turned, Oswald's view was partially blocked by some trees, it looks like. Then he decides to start firing at the president with his junky, scoped Carcano." Henry nodded as his uncle went on. "So I guess it's pretty obvious that this Oswald guy was no shooter. and didn't know that the Carcano is in an unsafe junker that's really slow to operate. And we can assume he didn't know that with a cheap scope, it's even harder to pick up a target moving on a sideways angle, particularly with part of your view blocked by trees. Hell, he didn't even have the sense to take a clear shot with his target coming straight at him. But when this guy who obviously doesn't know anything about shooting a rifle does start firing at the president, he suddenly turns into somebody that Winchester would have put on an exhibition circuit. Max held up his hands and started ticking off his points on his fingers. He manages to find his moving target, fire, pull the gun out of recoil, work the bolt, find his moving target in the scope again, and repeat the process for a whole magazine. He hit Kennedy twice, once in the back and once in the head. For Christ's sake. And, Henry broke in, he puts another bullet into that other guy, Governor Connolly. Mon prompted him, still hanging on every one of Henry and Max's words. Yeah, Connolly, Henry agreed, getting more animated. And he does all this superb shooting in what? 5 seconds? He shook his head. If Ad Toppervine and Herb Parsons were still alive, I don't think either one of them could do that kind of shooting with a Carcano. I know I couldn't come close. Maybe with another rifle and sufficient practice. This nut who knows nothing about shooting but decides to kill the president anyway using the worst possible equipment and taking the worst possible shot somehow manages to do it? Bullshit. Max Collins spat. No such thing as that much luck. God himself couldn't pull that one off. There had to be other shooters, for sure. There had to be. Erwin Mons said nothing but nodded, fascinated by the persuasive analysis. He looked at his brother-in-law, nodding his understanding. Max added another comment. And now the man most likely to tell us who else was involved has conveniently been killed. He's been killed by a strip club owner with a pro's gun using a pro's technique, who did it, we are told, out of respect for the Kennedy family. Max snorted. And may I also point out that this strip club owner happens to be Jewish, and the head of the family this Jewish strip club owner professes to respect so much is old Joe Kennedy, who never made any secret of his admiration for the Nazi regime. Max Collins laughed without humor. Don't expect this deal to make any sense anytime soon. Curiouser and curiouser, Walter Bowman murmured. He was arguably the most literate person in the room. New chapter here. Here on page 175, we conclude Chapter 59, Theorizing, November 24th, 1963. Chapter 60, Birthday, January 10th, 1964, shall be in the following video of this series. It is presently 1:04 a.m. on Sunday, June 7th, 2020. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Auf Wiedersehen.